Any and all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 continuous hours. Police, fire, and emergency medical services will be unavailable until tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. when the purge concludes. Blessed be our new founding fathers and America, a nation reborn. May God be with you all.
Everything we can find. Go get everything we can find. These are the boys right here. This is the team. There's more stuff that we can put out here. Hey, there's 3 picnic tables up here. There's a couple picnic tables up here. Let's go on. Come on, now. Go get everything we can find. Go get everything we can find. These are the boys right here. This is the team.
To protect the cops, but it was just to protect the people. And what I can't understand is that this is Cincinnati police. This is not Minneapolis police, and what they're doing is just absolutely horrendous. As a member of city council, this is my first time ever seeing something like this. When this first happened in 2001, I was only 17 years old, right? I can't understand for the life of me what is going on right now in the city of Cincinnati. And I'm going to be here until these folks and other folks are protected. Let me tell you something. There are people down here who are encouraging 14-year-old kids. These babies are 14 years old, man, and they're encouraging them to throw bottles at these cops. And these grown people are encouraging our babies to fight. This is not their fight. And I will give a how mad or angry you are with what is happening with the police. But these 15-year-old kids have nothing to do with this, man. And these cops, black cops, white cops, or whatever like that, they did not do anything. And I'm not here to take one side or the other, but what I'm suggesting to the people of Cincinnati is that what type of success are you going to have with attacking these people that have nothing to do with this? And what I'm saying is that you got people down here who are literally encouraging kids to attack cops. You're encouraging the kids to attack cops, and they're using Emmett Till. They're using Martin Luther King to justify why these 14 and 15-year-old kids should be out here. These are former students of mine. You see what I'm saying? I am imploring that before this pops and this gets bad, they're throwing bricks. They just threw a brick at the cops. It's wrong. I'm telling you, it's wrong. And I'm so nervous and I'm so scared for these kids. These are kids. There are kids around. There are kids across the street who live downtown in City West, and these people are out here encouraging them. And as an elder in the African American community, if any African American is encouraging these 14 and 15-year-old kids to be out here, they're wrong. That's wrong. These cops didn't do anything to George Floyd. This is wrong. I don't get how you see it. It's wrong.
Thank you.
And sorry for cussing.
Communist groups, including the extremist organization Antifa, are hijacking what started out as peaceful protests over the death of an unarmed black man to usher in a revolution. That's according to officials, experts' videos, and anarchists' own words.
Protests turned destructive in downtown Seattle tonight. Here's what we know as of 10 o'clock. Protests started at about noon today in Seattle, but turned destructive right around 4 p.m. when someone lit a Seattle police cruiser on fire. Since then, we have seen widespread looting and destruction downtown. A curfew took effect at 5 p.m. tonight. It is in effect until 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. Seattle police are now blocking all traffic coming into the city. Also tonight, we should let you know that 200 members of the Washington National Guard have been called up to come into Seattle. 75 have been deployed to Seattle tonight. The other 125 will arrive in the city tomorrow. All of this started earlier today with a peaceful protest at about noon just outside Seattle Police Headquarters. People protesting the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. At 3 o'clock, a large gathering took place. Thousands of people at Westlake Park in Seattle. Again, that started peacefully, but then about 3:45, pandemonium broke out. The police cruiser set on fire. As many as 8 other police cars set fire, and then police moved in to try to disperse the crowd. You're looking at police pepper spraying people, and there's another one of those burned vehicles right there. Not long after that, people started breaking into a number of stores in downtown Seattle. The Westlake area is the shopping district in Seattle. Nordstrom, Helly Hansen, Old Navy, and a number of other stores have been seriously looted. Let's go to King 5's Michael.
Unfortunately, the aftermath of George Floyd's death has produced a second challenge to the rule of law. While many have peacefully expressed their anger and grief, others have hijacked protests to engage in lawlessness. Violent rioting, arson, looting of businesses and public property, assaults on law enforcement officers and innocent people, and even the murder of a federal agent. Such senseless acts of anarchy are not exercises of First Amendment rights. They are crimes designed to terrify fellow citizens and intimidate communities. As I told the governors on Monday, we understand the distinction between 3 different sets of actors here. The large preponderance of those who are protesting are peaceful demonstrators who are exercising their First Amendment rights. At some demonstrations, however, there are groups that exploit the opportunity to engage in such crimes as looting. And finally, at some demonstrations, there are extremist agitators who are hijacking the protests to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. We have evidence that Antifa and other similar extremist groups, as well as actors of a variety of different political persuasions, have been involved in instigating and participating in the violent activity. And we are also seeing foreign actors playing all sides to exacerbate the violence.
On the basis of this agreement, and to send 20,000 American military forces there. Are you enthusiastically behind that call?
Very much so. I think that we have a grave responsibility for what happened there. I've been very critical of the administration's policies there. And now that we have a chance to build peace or to maintain peace, we must make that move because we are involved. You know, we are part of the embargo on armaments. So we are one way or another party to this horrible slaughter. And so now here's our chance to do something to maintain peace, and we mustn't fail.
Do you think the American public has the will to withstand, for the lack of a better expression, body bags coming home?
I very much hope so. I understand that public opinion is divided pretty evenly, and there's very strong opposition in Congress, particularly from the
the freshmen seem to be against it. I mean,
very much so, and it is actually that part is an isolationist kind of reaction.
Of all the financial titans and philanthropists of the 20th century, none are more complex or mysterious than George Soros. Like Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and the Rockefellers, he amassed billions through ruthless business decisions, only to turn around and give away most of his fortune to advance his own personal philosophy. He can move world financial markets simply by voicing an opinion, or destabilize a government by buying and selling its currency. He also pledged more aid last year to help people in Russia than the U.S. government did. But now George Soros is worried. He thinks the global economy is coming apart at the seams and that the world needs to be protected from people like George Soros.
We may now think that everything is fine, but the fact is that the system is broke and it needs fixing.
What you're doing is asking some form of regulation to protect the world against you.
Well, I am a player, and I think all players should be regulated. There have to be rules of the game.
Take 81,000 to buy 48,000, buy him 69,000 YUM.
Right now, his Quantum Group hedge fund moves $14 billion of rich investors' money around the world every day, looking for profits and answering to no one. Soros makes huge bets on whole countries and economies. Last year, when he saw cracks in the Asia boom, he began selling the currency in Thailand. Traders in Hong Kong followed suit, triggering a financial crisis that plunged much of Asia into a depression.
In the last 2 years, you've been blamed for financial collapse of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and Russia.
All of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Are you that powerful?
No, I think there's a great misunderstanding.
The Prime Minister of Malaysia said that the region spent 40 years trying to build up its economy, and along comes a moron like Soros with a lot of money, and it's all over. He called you a criminal.
It's easier for him to blame an outside force than to admit that they were mismanaging their economy and their currency. The French finance minister talked about hanging speculators from lampposts.
Soros says the Asian currencies would have collapsed even if he hadn't been in the market. They were overvalued. He says people tend to follow his lead because he's been so successful.
I think that I've been blamed for everything. I am basically there to make money. I cannot and do not look at the social consequences of what I do.
This man is a carnivore of the first order.
Jim Grant is the editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer and one of Wall Street's most respected analysts. He never tires of watching Soros, in part because of the huge bets he's willing to place on his hunches.
He has always amazed the people he's worked with at his audacity and his willingness to back up his commitments with enormous sums of money. It causes the blood to drain from ordinary mortals' faces.
Like risking $2 billion in Russia. When the Russian market began falling apart in August, Soros was the country's single largest investor. He called the U.S. Treasury and asked Uncle Sam for $7 billion to prop up the ruble. When U.S. officials failed to intervene, Soros wrote a letter to the Financial Times of London saying he thought the Russian currency should be devalued by as much as 25%. A few words from Soros were enough to cause panic selling that fueled the crash.
What's it like to have a statement that you make have such serious, grievous consequences? I mean, you can, it looks to me like in a number of situations you can take a position against a currency or make a statement, and the whole country falls apart.
Well, it's a tremendous sense of responsibility, actually. And it's also a humbling experience because I am actually trying to do the right thing, and sometimes what I do has an unintended negative consequence, as it did in Russia.
For both the Russian middle class and for Soros, who lost his $2 billion. Whatever his motivations, no one can accuse him of greed. He's backed away from the day-to-day operation of his businesses and is giving away his billions now with the same determination that he made them in places like Haiti, a country that has less money in the bank than he does. Last month, he brought the First Lady with him for a look at some of the projects his foundation is funding.
This is Mr. George Soros, and he's going to be helping the hospital.
This year, Soros plans to give away almost $500 million around the world. In Bosnia, when the water supply to Sarajevo was cut off at the height of the siege, it was Soros who wrote a check to jury-rig a pipeline through an abandoned highway tunnel.
$5 million up front can be more valuable than $50 million a year or two later.
Ambassador Richard Holbrooke brokered the peace in Bosnia.
At one point, after the Dayton peace agreements in Bosnia in 1995, for a considerable period of time, George had given more money to implement the peace agreements than the U.S. government had. He just could move that fast.
In Russia, he pledged $100 million to help scientists who might otherwise have sold their expertise to bidders like Iran or Iraq. In Eastern Europe, he's educated a new generation. And in Ukraine, he spent millions retraining the old Soviet military.
At the center of George Soros, there's an inherent contradiction. Which is, on one hand, you're the capitalist who does not care about the social consequences of his act, and on the other hand, you are a philanthropist who cares only about social consequences. How do you resolve the two?
Recognizing that as a competitor, I've got to compete to win. As a human being, I am concerned about the society in which I live.
Which George Soros am I talking to now? The amoral George Soros or the moral George Soros?
It's one person. It's one person who at one time engages in amoral activities and at the rest of the time tries to be moral.
What sort of a financial deal should Obama be seeking to strike when he travels to China next month?
No, I think this would be the time, because you really need to bring China into the creation of a new world order, financial world order. They are kind of reluctant members of the IMF. They play along, but they don't make much of a contribution because it's not their institution. Their share is not commensurate. Their voting rights are not commensurate to their weight. So I think you need a new world order that China has to be part of the process of creating it. I then decided to set up this foundation, Open Society Fund, with the objective of opening up closed societies, helping to make open societies more viable, and fostering a critical mode of thinking. There are basically two major sources of poverty and misery in the world today. One, Jeffrey Sachs explained to us, is bad location. The other is bad government. And that is something that you could really do something. Now, I think the one thing you can do is to offer incentives, encouragements, reinforcements to countries that are moving in the right direction. You know, giving money away in a funny way is much more difficult than making it, because when you make money, you have a bottom line and it tells you are you successful or not. When you try to, let's say, improve society, you affect different people and different interests differently, and they are not actually commensurate. So you very often have all kinds of unintended adverse consequences. So I had to experiment, and it was a learning process. The first part was this subversive activity, disrupting repressive regimes. That was a lot of fun, and that's actually what got me hooked on this whole enterprise. Then after, as the system started, the communist system started to collapse, one had to build an open society, and that was much more laborious and hard slugging. Education was clearly something where there were relatively few adverse consequences. So giving scholarships to outstanding talents, that was good and important. For instance, we introduced Head Start in all the countries where we have foundations, spent over $100 million doing it, and it was really questionable whether we would have a systemic effect. I think we have done quite well, but it was touch and go. Health, another issue, helping civil society. So it was a gradual learning process with foundations in each country run by people in the country who were in charge of determining how the money should be used, because they know the conditions in their countries better than somebody coming from the outside. And then seeing what works in one country, trying it in the other countries. So it was like a kind of what developed a matrix, in fact, that we had national foundations, and then we had certain... I got here through a rather circuitous route, because I first started out in South Africa, which at that time had an apartheid regime, which had all the institutions of an open society, but it was only for the whites. So to try to open it up seemed like a very worthwhile objective. I wasn't very successful. And then I turned to my native Hungary and Poland and the countries of Eastern Europe that were under communist rule. And there, the foundation was really successful in providing an alternative. And the idea there was that the dogma, the state party line is false, because it's imposed by force. And if you provide an alternative, then people can see the falsehood, and the regime will crumble. And in fact it did. As this system collapsed, I moved in to help build an open society, because the collapse of a closed society doesn't lead automatically to an open society, because open society is more complex. It's a higher level of organization, so you need a helping hand, a step up. You need somebody from the outside helping you to make that step up. And unfortunately, the West didn't quite realize this, and so I did, and I moved in there and concentrated on those countries, set up foundations locally, and they made their contribution. But then I became concerned with the problems of globalization, where you have global markets, but you have politics based on the sovereignty of states. So how do you deal with that issue? And then I came to the realization that open society is endangered by our current leadership in this country. And that is when I refocused my attention on the United States.